Hello, I'm Senem Denktaş, a partner in Project Finance Practice Group of Hergüner Bilgen Özeke Law Firm, one of the leading independent international law firm in Turkey. Today I will give brief responses to queries posed to understand Turkish PPP market generally and how COVID-19 is perceived from the PPP contractual scheme. But initially, let me give some basic figures to illustrate how COVID-19 was spread within the country so far. Total number of COVID-19 tests conducted so far is slightly over 8.6 million. Total number of patients is close to 300,000, and unfortunately the total number of COVID-19 related deaths is slightly over 7,000. Immediately after the first case reported on 10th of March, Turkey actually has contained the COVID-19 pandemic spread relatively quickly by implementing wide range of measures including curfews, social distancing, mobility restrictions like travel bans, and health policies. You can see from diagram on slide 8, which reflects a World Bank comparison study on a daily cases basis, that Turkey managed to keep the numbers relatively in a less fluctuation form compared to some other countries in Europe or the US itself. This success can also be linked to some PPP-related factors, such as the easily accessible and affordable public healthcare services. At this point, we should emphasize the role of 11 integrated health campuses currently in operation, constructed through the PPP model available in different regions of Turkey, an additional pandemic hospital converted from a BOT model airport facility. We would also need to make reference to high number of intensive care units in healthcare facilities, again due to PPP-related measures implemented by the Minister of Health. Now, let me also give some overview of Turkey PPPs in Turkey generally. Starting from 1980s, Turkey became one of the major markets opting for PPP model-based investments, hosting many mega or landmark projects, which are among the highest value PPPs or size-wise constitute largest projects in the world. Turkey does not have a single framework or an umbrella legislation governing PPPs, but as a country, it actually developed its own legislation pursuant to each specific sector or each specific model. And this implementation of sector-specific project model-related legislation can also be seen as, for example, the BOT model legislation, the Build, Operate, Transfer model applicable for infrastructure projects, highways and airports, electricity generation facilities, BLT model, the Build, Lease, Transfer model for healthcare projects, and also education projects, but so far no education project has been implemented yet in Turkey. TOR, the transfer of operating rights for ports and airports, and BO, Build Operate model for electrical energy generation facilities. You can also look at the slides from 12 to 16 for the comparison of this PPP legislation in Turkey in a sort of a detailed manner. In addition to these BLT, BOT, BO or TO related models, Turkey has also implemented certain PPP projects through use of intergovernmental agreements, IGAs. Mainly nuclear power plants and oil transportation pipelines related energy projects were actually hosting this IGA model. In Turkey, so far there are 249 PPP projects spread over different sectors. When we look at the sectors and models, we can see that so far, at least number-wise, energy sector seems to be one of the sectors having the leading role for the PPP model, whereas the BOT model with 46% seems to be the model leading the way as the most preferred PPP model in Turkey. We have a question as to how our country is coping with the pandemic and if COVID-19 constitutes a force majeure for PPP projects. First, the legislative background is silent on that issue. Except for healthcare BLT regulation, other PPP legislations does not provide a definition of force majeure, so the general principles of Turkish law, together with the contractual provisions under each relevant PPP contract, will apply when determining the FM and its sort of implications. Pandemics are customarily listed in PPP contracts as a type of force majeure event, excusing the performance of obligations of the private parties, provided that such events are of course unforeseeable and beyond the control of the contracting party, and it prevents the relevant contracting party from performing its obligation despite taking all necessary measures, etc. So the universal force majeure related criteria will still be equally applicable. The force majeure relief is normally, in majority of the PPP contracts, is granted only to the private side. Such a sort of a relief is not sort of most of the time recognized for the administration or for the state party. Contractually, we note that almost all PPP contracts include force majeure provisions, often use an open-ended list of exemplary force majeure events. And as mentioned, pandemics is in most of them counted as one of the events constituting a force majeure. After this contractual base, a case-by-case analysis should be made based on sector specifics and development stage of each project when determining whether or not a force majeure relief can be applicable for a specific contractual obligation of a private party. Projects in construction phase are more likely to be affected from COVID-19 and hence triggering the FM reliefs subject to contractual conditions, of course. Whereas projects in operation phase may necessitate a further and different purpose-based analysis depending on the sector they are in. For example, in airport operations, the airport operations are affected from COVID-19, while hospital operations cannot be easily or at least fully excused due to COVID-19 because it's their purpose to be active in the sector even there is a pandemic. The state side so far kept a silent approach towards baptizing COVID-19 as a force majeure event in specifically PPP models. But we should reserve that there was a presidential circular issued back in April this year categorizing COVID-19 as a force majeure event in respect to contracts awarded subject to public procurement laws. But such sort of categorization or classification has not been announced on a generic basis for PPP laws related projects. As I said, the state so far kept a silent approach toward this COVID-19. However, this silence should not be regarded as a negative response or a rejection by the state side for implementing FM reliefs, but should be seen as a sort of a cautious approach where the state side is trying to have a strategic and full picture perspective towards COVID-19, and then it will start to implement the relevant FM relief related measures after having a full sort of picture perspective and after coming to terms with the relevant private parties. But one thing we know for sure is that if any approach is adopted by a specific state side in a PPP contract, state side authority, the same and identical approach will need to be adopted towards all the private parties active in that specific PPP model or PPP sort of contract by virtue of non-discrimination of obligations imposed by the laws. The final question is, how do we see the recovery in our country for the PPPs or with the PPPs? First, we should note that in Turkey, historically, there was a sort of a challenge-based trend towards PPP projects coming from the concession era. Such trend has lost some power towards new PPP models, but still there is some level of skepticism and criticism on the sustainability of this sort of, or at least the prioritization of the PPP projects for Turkey, particularly with respect to projects with state-backed volume or demand guarantees, debt assumptions, or other forms of public financing support, or projects reflecting questionable results after a value for money analysis. Post-COVID era, this skepticism may further be fueled by negatively affected economy, prompting people to question the value for money and prioritization analysis with more scrutiny. Current status of Turkish economy may also influence the state to prioritize other measures for the general economic recovery of the country rather than using the resources for new large-scale PPP investments, which may result in possible new PPP projects being sidetracked or otherwise initiated only upon a very specific high priority need or policy preference of the state. However, in this interim period, during which the larger PPP projects are expected to slow down a little bit, we could use this period as an opportunity by all stakeholders, be it the state or the private parties, sponsored or the lenders, to assist the public to understand and embrace the PPPs in Turkey in general.